Thank you. Hello, everyone. Could you go next slide? So I guess this will be the agenda for this whole session. And right now we will look into the Database Preservation Toolkit. Could you go? Okay, stop there. I'm Luis Faria from Keep Solutions, and I'm product manager of open source solutions that we developed for digital preservation, and one of which is the Database Preservation Toolkit. As you may guess, this focuses on databases, and it is usually information that supports institutions and businesses is centralized on databases. And of course, this information is of great value and needs to be preserved many times for decades due to strategic or legal reasons. And the systems that have this information are usually complex, composed of many software components besides the database management system, each playing their part, supporting the business logic and the submission of and presentation interfaces. The information ends up being organized in a structure specifically optimized for the database and your original business objectives, and which means it is not ready to be directly consumed by users. Next, please. And the main problem on preserving the information is that every database vendor has its specific data types and export formats. It is rare that information export from one vendor systems works seamlessly on another, and sometimes the export doesn't even work in different versions of the same product. So we need a vendor agnostic format based on standards to preserve information in databases. Next, please. So what makes a good preservation format? Well, there are here some criteria. It should have a widespread use, a good support, be an open standard format, have good documentation, be stable, easy to identify with format identifiers, have a format validator, which is very important when you're receiving data from other institutions. Should have shouldn't have any intellectual property constraints, and should have support metadata, should not be overly complex, should be enable interoperability, provide error detection facilities, easy to reuse, etc. These are a set of criteria defined by the National Archives of the UK, and it's a good start point to define your requirements for a format for long-term preservation. Next, please. So currently on our analysis, the format that marks higher in all of those criteria is the CR format. It was specifically created to be a database preservation format, and it is based on international standards, and it focused on preserving the database data, structure, and documenting the behavior. It is a Swiss national standard, and it's now managed by the DLC's board and the EU eArchiving building block. And you can check more information about this on those websites. Next, please. So what I'd like to show you today is a set of open source tools that allow you to store the content of relational databases in a standard archival format. These focus not only on databases as database management systems, but also systems that are supported by databases and where no easier path for database for preservation is found. The main three tools are so the set of tools divided in three kind of modules that depend on the context that you like to use them. And the first one is the Database Preservation Toolkit Desktop, which is a desktop application to save the database to a preservation format. It allows also to validate it, and it has some albeit a bit limited, some browse and search content features, limited in terms of size of the database. Then there is the Database Preservation Toolkit Enterprise, which is a web application that can be installed on your institution that allow you to browse and search the content of multiple and very large preserved databases. And the final one is the developer, which is at the same time a command line tool and a development library that is mainly used for automation and systems integration. Next, please. So let's go through the desktop basic features. The desktop is a desktop application, and it's available on Windows and Mac OS, and also on Linux. It has these aspects. Next. It allows to create or to export the connect to your database management system and export all of part of the content into a preservation format like CRD. It allows you to test the connection and allow you to diagnose most common problems and provide you helpful hints to solve them. And it supports it has base support for Microsoft Access, Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL, or now MariaDB, Oracle in several versions of it, PostgreSQL, Progress OpenEdge, Sybase, especially Sybase ASA, or now called SAP, and it may support other formats in the form of a generic GDBC connection, although these are the ones that are tested and which export was validated into some level. Next one. During the archival process, it will allows you to access detailed reports of the migration changes and losses. This is due to conversion that is required from vendor-specific formats or types, or column types and column data types into standard ones. And all the export and selection parameters are presented. The mapping of the column data types into the standard types are recorded. And if there are compromises, as the tool is flexible to allow the maximum amount of data to be archived, and sometimes this means taking some compromises, they are documented on the report. Next. It allows also, as we've seen, as it's one of the requirements to record to enrich the CRD with descriptive metadata. There are some generic database level metadata, like the archivist that did the extraction, the client machine, the product, and so on. Even the time span where the export focuses on. But it also allows you to edit metadata from the several smaller entities of the database, like the tables and the columns and the views and so on. Next one. There is also a validation feature, which allows you to validate against the specification, plus many additional checks for a very thorough validation. The CRD specification and the additional checks are documented on the links that are accessible on the validation panel itself. Next one. It allows also to have search, browse and search features. Included in the system is a Google-like search on the database content, which allows you to, for example, search on all records on all tables of the database, and then you can drill down onto specific tables and do advanced search for specific fields and find exactly what you are looking for. Next. It has auto-update features, which will notify you when there's a new version that improves the system. Next. And there are many other features. I will provide a complete list in the end for the desktop application. For the enterprise one, um, for Database Preservation Toolkit Enterprise is a bit different, as it is an application to be installed for a large institution with many databases. It can span its backend through many servers, so it supports very, very large databases accessed by many users if required. It also can be installed on a single machine if that would be the focus of the installation. Next. This system allows to manage the multiple databases that are integrated, search through the database, manage their status, enrich their metadata, again, validate them, make it ready for the users to search. It has all the features of the desktop and more. Next. And mainly, this enterprise allows you to do database transformation, as the content normally is not, as I said, optimized for users. There may be many tables and on the database that make the information difficult to follow or to export. And the system allows you to do what we call denormalization, which is, I'll explain a bit later on the slide, but it allows you to reduce the complexity of the view. It also allows you to hide some tables and hide some columns, and allow to simplify the browsing, and even to allow some level of anonymization of the content. Next one. The transformation is when, or denormalization is when there are information that is spread out through different tables, and this is used many times in a relational database, as it is a mechanism for software development. But then it makes no sense to present this directly to the users. And as the requirements for access change and the information needs to be displayed in a different way for users decades after the database was decommissioned, the system allows you to do this on the interface that allows for users to access it, and putting it in a way that people can readily search for it and understand it. Next one. It also allows you to integrate with a single sign-on or external authentication systems like LDAP, Active Directory, and so on, which includes also EID or some implementations of the EID authentication systems, like the Portuguese EID authentication system. Next one. Um, And after authenticating, you can allow or provide access to users that can be prepared and made user-friendly and anonymized database content. You can prepare saved searches. You can define exactly how the information should be presented, and then the user can search through it and get the results they are looking for. Next one. In the end, they can find the specific set of information they want, and then export the data for their own purposes. They can export into tabular data, which then can be opened by any spreadsheet software like Microsoft Excel, and do some other easy analytics or even diagrams. Next one. There is a very thorough activity log. So every action and every access is recorded. So we comply with the ISO 16363 requirement that dictates that this should be the case. Next one. The interface is currently translated into several languages: English, German, Estonian, Czech, and Portuguese. Others can be added quite easily. There is a translation integration with the Transifex translation system. support system. The backend system is already ready to support many other languages of the content. So we can have all the Google-like features of the searching in the content. Next one. On the developer, there are just a couple of features I would like to state. Next. There is a command line interface. This mainly is used for automation of periodic preservation tasks. For example, to extract periodic partial extracts of a live database, and this is done actually in production in some cases, or to do other periodic tasks. Next one. The same developer also allows you to use it as a Java library and use it for integration with production systems, or to directly use database preservation features on your system, or as a middleware. Next one. So the system is all open source. The code base allows you to do custom development for new features, or even to integrate with other possible ideas. For example, to have it disconnected with linked data and so on. And it also allows you to add quite easily yourself support for new legacy database systems. Next one. So there are many more features, and we don't have time to go through all of them. There's here a complete list to point out, for example, geodata and other kinds of, and to migrate CR back to live database management systems are one of the features. Next one. So I would like to end with a view of how this can be useful for data creators. So mainly, it allows you to archive and provide access to legacy databases, but also legacy information systems that are supported by databases. But this is also used not only in even in real world cases in current implementations to archive production databases or systems. So things that are currently alive and not only legacy, for snapshots or even to incremental. So this works to also to restore archived databases into modern database management systems, or to provide access to these, but also to alleviate the load of production systems, which cannot which can be overloaded with archival information. Next one. So this is the very short presentation. A full webinar is available on the webinar series 2020, and also on the YouTube video channel that Jamie presented before. So if you have more information, please see databasepreservation.com or contact us. Thank you.
Excellent, wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Lewis. So now we're going to look at a use case, and that's the Norwegian National Health Archive. So to go through this use case, we've got Stephen Mackey, and we've got Hanne-Marie Hindcleff. So I hand over to you, Stephen, is it?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. Yes, my name's Stephen Mackey. I'm representing Pickle in Norway, and I have with me Hanne-Marie Hindcleff, who's the system owner at the Norwegian Health Archive. And we're talking about a project in Norway to create a centralized national health archive, which activity has actually driven and informed the development of the eArchiving eHealth 1 content information type specification. Next slide, please.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Hanne-Marie. I work as the system owner at the Norwegian Health Archive. We have a project that we build a digital preservation system to preserve both digitized and electronically created patient archives for eternally. We keep track of the journals with our very own health archive register index, and this is also our health register, and it's one of the national health registers here in Norway. We tried to make the standard for digitized material as close as the electronically created materials as possible, because we needed to treat them likewise in the HARI, the register index. We have a separate standard for a submission index that helps us populate the metadata both in the ZIPs and in the HARI. And we also have developed a tool that validates the extract before making the EPJ ZIPs. And we are offering this tool both to the hospitals and other that want to send archives to us. Next slide, please. Here's an overall system diagram of our system. We have Archamatica as the preservation engine. We have the HARI as the register. And we have two search interfaces in HARI. We have one for next of kin search and one for the researchers. We also have a pre-ingest function that helps us repack and normalize the ZIPs before ingesting them to Archamatica. We also have different storages in different technologies in different geographical places. And we are connected to external registers to make the metadata as perfect as possible. Next slide, please.
So one of the important factors on the NHA project was that it was driven by legislation, and the legislation actually described the use cases for the archive, the why of why you would build this. And as Hanna-Marie mentioned, it was one to allow transparency. That's in providing a complete linear patient medical record to next of kin of deceased persons. To support the open information regulation in Norway. And secondly, it was to actually use this vast amount of historical medical information for research and for development of new treatment plans. The actual legacy data, there was no limit to the age of the records that were going to be presented, and they consisted of both physical and electronic patient records. So there's a very large digitization program that's gone alongside the development of the archive. Next. So in Norway, they developed their own standards for extraction of patient medical records from source electronic health and medical record systems from hospitals, and for the digitization of the journals. The standards, the specification actually specified the standards to be used for the metadata that should be included with the archival packages. And the standard actually presented a taxonomy for structuring the archival packages from the extractions from the source electronic medical record systems. But when we started the Health One work in development of a open standards-based specification as part of the eArchiving building block, one of the issues we found that the standards in Norway were not based on international medical or archiving metadata standards such as METS or PREMIS. Next, please. So very quickly, this one of the very useful things that's come out of the project in Norway is looking in detail at the different ways and the different abilities of the source EMR systems to extract information. And this varies widely depending on the age of the systems and sophistication, the sizes of the organizations that are extracting the data, and can range from just a single summary document for an entire patient record up to a very complex structure based on cases, documents, files, and byte streams, which together form a complete linear patient medical record. So this case structure has been incorporated at the heart of the eHealth1 content information type specification. Next, please.
Yeah, so in Norway, we have these two big suppliers of systems, and they both like to be a part of defining the workflow. We have started one pilot project that's where we are testing extracting electronic health records and transferring them through the NA chain. It's a special network in Norway, which most of the health facilities is connected to. We have to have the EPJ ARC and the AVAL XML to be understood by the vendor to get the extracts as we want. And therefore, we need to give them the validation tool. First of all, to not going into a loop with the extract. And we also see that we need to define the limitations. We need to find the limitations of the transfer for the system, of number of patients, etc. There's a lot of stuff that no one knows about, and it's both a Norwegian system and international system here in Norway. So we are quite open to what we will find. Next slide, please.
So the eHealth1 SITS has been based on a very practical and real case, which is the NHA archive. And the actual initial remit actually stated that we should develop it based on this very real case. Next slide, please. And in summary, we're building on that as a foundation and the practical experience. This, of course, then builds on the common specification, the CSIP, and the package specifications, which are essential parts of the eArchiving building block. It also adds a number of things in making submission agreements mandatory in forming an agreement between the source organizations and the archive. It uses this very well-developed case, subcase, document file structure, which was developed for the Norwegian EPJ specification. But it extends that by making allowance for encapsulated bit streams, such as DICOM. The specification, like the experience in Norway, can be used both in digitalization programs or for born digital extractions. And currently, it's limited in scope to the extraction directly from electronic medical record systems at hospitals, and doesn't consider extraction, say, from centralized EHR systems or submission via clinical documents. But these are possible, so it's a very flexible framework which we can enhance in future. Next, please. So what does it contain? It's got a very extensible descriptive metadata model, which can range from the very basic to the very complex, depending on the ability of the source systems to export. It builds on the common specification. It uses METS, so an international standard for metadata encoding. It uses PREMIS, preservation metadata international standard. It's patient-centric. And as such, it recommends the use of international metadata standards, such as the FHIR patient resource. And it has very extensible ability to encapsulate clinical metadata, which is essential in the researcher use case in enabling researchers to actually search the archive and create cohorts of information for research purposes. And for this, it recommends the use of the FHIR resources, such as condition, allergy intolerance, procedure, etc., which, if they can be sourced as structured metadata from the source systems, can then be structured within the archival packages and can be searched. Thank you. Next slide. So next steps, in summary, we're now embarking on a stream of software development as part of the eArchiving building block A3 stream. And we intend to build a SIP creator tool which produces eHealth1 submission packages directly from source EMR systems. This again, building on the experience and the lessons learned in Norway, is where one of the barriers appears to be the ability of the hospitals to actually extract data, or in the motivation for the EMR system vendors to actually adapt their software. So we're looking to create something which will work in almost any environment and will create conformant packages for a e-archiving system. We're then looking to try to pilot implementation of that based around our experience with the NHA system, and of course using available eArch software. So thank you very much.
Okay, TAC, as I think they say up north, for this clear presentation. So we have now some time for a general Q&A. So this could be on the two presentations that we've just heard, or also any questions that we've had from the morning. I haven't seen any in the chat, so now is the time if anyone has any questions to please share them. I'll give people a couple of minutes to think, and if not, then brilliant. Here we go. Oh, that is a question in itself, Agencia, but not the kind that we may be anticipating.
Let's wait just 1 minute in case someone is
Exactly.
writing, and if not, we can move on.
Mm-hmm. And as I hope everyone noticed in the chat, that we've shared the link to the webinar series. As we saw, one participant was keen to have the link, so there you can find the recording of the webinar that Lewis mentioned, as well as all the recordings of the webinars that have taken place over the past year.
So I guess we got the question.
Yes. So regarding DBTK, will there be support for templates for database metadata edits to reuse documentation? So
Well, there hasn't been a request for it up to now. So what will normally happen is that there is a documentation created, and these types of documentations are not there is no current guideline to create documentation for preserving the database preservation, presentation, submission interface, and so on. So to do this kind of work, but then you'll need to use the tools to submit the information specific on the database itself. For example, if there are a set of columns that need more context to be understood, they need then to be added there, the documentation directly on the database. So that's the current way to work in that regard.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Lewis. I see we have another question. So from Anna, how do you approach the problem that organizations have more and more systems to register documents and information, sometimes even those who work with information in an organization aware what some information exists, and what is your system? I don't know, Lewis, if that's one you want to take as well.
I'm not sure if that's for me, but
Yeah.
I guess that there. I hope there is when you go into digital preservation, there is a set of tasks that you probably do, which includes doing an inventory of all the systems you have, digital and not, that keep the information, and then have a strategy on how to preserve them. and I hope that, of course, there is the legacy issue. So there are many systems already, and there is a lot of work to be done on every institution to do this kind of inventory and get a strategy. And sometimes the strategy might be database preservation, and sometimes might be another thing. And for new systems, I hope that for procurement of any system at all that keeps information, people start thinking on how in the future this information starts to be preserved and archived, so they can cope with this, including, for example, the eArchiving standards as part of the requirements for exporting that data from the system will be a good way to go for coping with having more and more systems into the institutions that then taking information out of these systems is not thought in advance.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Lewis. I think for Stephen and Hannah-Marie, we have a question on eHealth. So from Corinne, when eHealth anonymizes data, does it mean that you cannot go back to the original ones after a certain number of years?
Well, in fact, eHealth does not anonymize data. It's the patient centricity and quite rich metadata, personal data about each individual is important to the specification. It wouldn't be possible to do the next of kin searches without the patient data, and it's very personal data alongside the clinical metadata in producing valid research data. In order to make that patient personal data interchangeable, so we recommend the use of the FHIR resource, which is patient personal information.
Wonderful, thanks a lot. Keeping on the eHealth track, we had the question of how is the appraisal of medical records provided, and have you considered the two variants outlined? I won't read out the whole question. I think it's a bit overlong.
Yes, I'm looking at it. I'm trying to understand.
I can say for the EPJ arc and how we do it in Norway. We do it by producer, and I suppose it would be the same with eHealth, Stephen.
Yes, I mean, as you say, certainly for the project in Norway, we tried to push the quality control and appraisal as far back to the producer as we could, and as Hannah-Marie mentioned, as assisting that by production of tools that were actually deployed at the hospital themselves.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Bogdan on the DBTK. If the originating agency does not have the original database documentation, how can one know how the tables are connected and make the data transformation?
Yes, it is a commonplace for older databases and systems to lack documentation, and there needs to be what we have done up to now is to have an expert do reverse engineering on the database, on the content, on the application that presented did the presentation, did the submission interfaces to try to understand what is going on and understand the content that is there. You can also interview, if you can, the original submitters and people that work with this database to try to understand how the information was submitted and how it was presented, to get an idea of how the tables are connected and understand the content. So it can be hard work.
We're not afraid of hard work here. Voila. So we have from Matthias, well, maybe I am a bit more than I say. From Matthias, we have when a data transformation is defined in DBTK, I suppose the anonymized simplified data mart is created. It created adds up to the data preserved, and the original data is kept as well, and access to the original data can be limited, right?
Yes, yes. We normally won't give access to the original data. There is the shard, and this is exported kind of into a viewer system that allows you then to do the anonymized and simplified. So yes, the data that you select exactly what information is presented to the end user. There are also roles in the system that allow you to have an administrative role that does these kind of actions, accesses shard, does additions and so on, and hides data. And there is a normal user that accesses only the provided data. The transformations do not change the original data at all. So the original data maintains as it is, and this is done only on the viewer system.
Okay, obrigado, Luis.
Thank
Great
you.
stuff indeed. I quite agree. What we will do is that we will also publish answers to these questions. So obviously we have the speakers now answering live, but we will jot these down and publish along with the recording of the webinar. So you'll be able to consult the answers to the questions. If there are no more questions, here we go. On eHealth, how come you choose to specify a new standard for eHealth instead of using the SIR ARD as preservation format? Are these data not originally produced in databases? So Stephen, Honor?
Here in Norway, there are like a hybrid. We have both the databases and we have a lot of other systems, and there are tiny systems and there are large systems. There are international systems. So we need a standard that could connect to all the different varieties. Even though even those who doesn't have a database in as an engine. So it is to manage to take all the EHR, even those who are elderly and not up into our date. And it's also a patient focus in it. It's not an archive. It's not centered around the archive itself, but it's centered around the patient, and it's also a factor.
If I may, I can complete that answer. Actually, we have two eHealth specifications ongoing. One is from the Norwegian archives, and the other one is not yet announced. Is from the GRC, which is a research center by the Commission in Italy, and we are working with them as well. The thing is that eHealth is not incompatible with CR. Actually, indeed, eHealth, most of the data, or if not all, is kept in databases, and therefore it can be stored in a CR. It can be preserved. But once you have it in the database, it's because it has been encoded with some standard for the metadata, and that means that the name of the patient, some treatment, some problems, some issues that they have, or the doctor they visited, or some proofs that they got, all that would be in eHealth. And then they go to the database, and then the database can be stored. Also in the database, there could be, for example, the web pages or even the social media of an organization or any other information. So please correct me, Luis, but I believe that CR is really agnostic concerning preserving databases. So whichever
Yes.
database.
So the main idea is that CR does not create any rules for how the information is organized. It keeps the original structure of the database. If you want to define rules of how this information is organized and separated, then you may probably want to use other system. But if you cannot, then CIARD may be an option when there is no other better option. Note that we have use cases of hospitals using CIARD for uh, patient history for specific departments that could not export information from legacy databases. So mainly the CIARD is there is no one solution fits all problems here in mind.
Yeah, that is what I wanted to say, that they are not incompatible. They are actually CIARD is clearly agnostic or concerning eHealth. So maybe the eHealth application is not using particularly a database, but is using any other thing, like, I don't know, an XML repository or whatever. So it depends. It depends on each repository. So that was,
And
I believe,
the end result will be different, because when you archive CIARD, you're going to archive the whole system as a single record on your record system, and then you need to use a tool like the DBPTK Enterprise to view the content. While if you probably use SITs of eHealth SITs, you on your record system you will have the separated records from the separated patients and the separated information, as the presentation before showed.
Okay, thank you very much. So over to Tom. I believe that we can continue with, is there a break now?
There is, exactly, yeah. We've got a break now till past, and then we'll have the panel discussion. So what I do is I invite everyone to go get a coffee or a tea. If any more questions do come to mind, post them in the chat. We have one more Q&A coming up, or if we don't have time, we'll definitely do written answers. So feel free to add anything else into the chat. And many thanks to our speakers from this morning, from this first session. And we will see you at past. Okay, everyone, it's past, so it's time to get started with the next part of today's session, which is the penultimate moment. So now we are going to have a panel discussion. So Carlotta, who we already met earlier this morning, is going to be moderating this panel discussion, which is on the European Directive on Open Data and Fair Principles, Impact and Long-Term Preservation, Government and Research Data. Voilà, Carlotta, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Can I ask to our panelists to open your videos? Then please, next slide. Okay, this panel today is defined, the aim of the panel is defined as the discussion about the directive on open data and the reuse of public sector information that provides a common legal framework for an European market for government health data, public sector information. But it's true that although focusing on public sector information is transcription or transposition to national law, also interlinks with research data and the adoption of the FAIR principles. So in these panels, all that we want to debate is what will be the impact of this directive on data long-term preservation across the European member states. So next slide, please. So we have two things here. I am going to present, just to put in context the panel. That is, we have this directive on open data that was published in 2019 and must be transposed to national legislation in countries of the European Union. It has an important effect on several projects, as we already heard from the Norwegian Health Archive, and it is based on the need to open the data from the public sector and the reuse of this data. But here we want to explore the relationship with digital preservation, which is mentioned slightly in the directive, but opening a big issue to take in account. In the slide we have now on the screen, we can see the two places in the directive that the digital preservation is mentioned. It's yes in two places. One is in the whereas statement number 59 that talk about the long-term availability for reuse of public sector information and talk about preservation policies, and also in the Article 9 under practical arrangements that say that member states shall also encourage public sector bodies to make practical arrangements facilitating the preservation of documents available for reuse. So based in these two places where preservation is mentioned, and also taking in account that the FAIR principles, fundable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, there are the principles that are accepted for the scientific data as one of the aims we want to achieve, to have that data that could be compliant with these principles. This is the introduction for the panel. Next slide, please. We have an impressive cast of participants in this panel. Thank you very much to adapt your, for sure, busy agendas to be with us today. I am going to introduce them in a short way, what is not easy because all of them have done important things and participate in a lot of projects, but I don't want to use many time of the panel for the introduction. So I start in the same order they are going to speak after my introduction. First, we have Daniele Rizzi, that has a degree in civil engineering from the Politecnico di Milano University. Daniel joined the European Commission in 1993, but since 2012, he contributes to the development of policies in support to the European Data Economy in Commission Directorate General for Communication Networks, Content and Technology. And he is currently a policy officer in the unit Data Policy and Innovation, and is responsible for the recently adopted Open Data Directive, the Commission communication on our European data strategy, and the forthcoming regulation of high-value data sets. Then after Daniel, we are going to have Joy Davidson, that is coordinator of the UK Digital Curation Centre, a research infrastructure that specializes in data management, planning, curation, and open science. And Joy currently leads working package 3 of the first project funded by the European Commission, which aims to increase the production and use of FAIR data. She has been involved in reviews from previous roadmaps and several Horizon 2020 research infrastructure funding programs. After Joy, we are going to have Andreas Rauber, that is head of the Information and Software Engineering Group at the Department of Information Systems Engineer at the Vienna University of Technology. He has been a researcher also in Italy and France and has published numerous papers in refereed journals and international conference, and served as member board for several major journals, conferences, and workshops. But his research interests cover the broad scope of digital libraries and information spaces, including specifically text and music information retrieval and organization, information visualization, as well as data analysis, neural computation, and digital preservation. Igor Kuzma is a senior advisor of Geographical Information System and at Statistical Office of the Republic of Slovenia, where he works since 2004. His main activities are related to the integration of geospatial and statistical information at various levels of statistical production. And in 2008, he joined the dissemination unit and has worked since that on development of tools and infrastructure for dissemination of geospatial statistics as free open data. Recently, he again returned to the core production of geospatial statistics by leading a project of on-Earth observation data analysis. At the end, but not the less important, Jose Bourbinia is professor of computer science and engineer at the Lisbon University, and he is a researcher in the Information System and Decision Support Laboratory. And presently, Jose also is advisor for technology and digital transformation of the Secretary of State for the Innovation and Administrative Modernization of the Portuguese government. In this role, he is involved in the working group that is transposing for the Portuguese legislation the directive on open data. So next slide, please. Next, yes. So we have organized the panel with 4 questions for all of our panelists. The 4 questions are on the screen, and they are going to select which one of these 4 questions they want to answer. And so at the end, we are going to pass the floor to them, and at the end, if we have more time, we can discuss for a conclusion. And of course, after this is a question and answer session for all the audience. So please, Daniele, can you start?
Thank you, Carlota. Thank you for the nice introduction, and okay, welcome also from my side to the participants, the virtual participants, to this session. So, as Carlota introduced me, I work in the unit in the Commission, which is the author of the Open Data Directive. So in a way, we have I think I have a certain easy role here, because our aim in in having adopted this new directive, it's a directive which is based on previous ones, but it is a further creating ways of making more open data available, generated by public administrations. In a way, we are also part of the problem, because our aim is to create more and more data available for use. And definitely, reuse is not something which happens on the spot. Reuse is something which may happen for a big amount of data also retrospectively. So archiving is extremely important, because data have a certain value when they are generated, but they have also a big value, maybe not all of them, but many of them have also a big value. For example, I can just make the example of statistical series. So historical series in statistics are extremely important. I do not only want to know what is the GDP generated in my country this year or last year, but also I need to see what happened 50 years ago or whenever. So preserving is extremely important. And of course, the more we generate the data and the more we make available data, also thanks to the directive, but in general, the world is generating an enormous amount of data, more and more. Of course, the problem of archiving and preserving this data is extremely important. And to go to, in a way, the second question which I have here. I'm not an expert in what archives are doing, but I think that a crucial role there, apart from the obvious one of preserving information, is making a selection. It's clear that we cannot preserve everything. The huge amount of data which is generated today cannot be stored indefinitely. It makes no sense. So I think the big challenge here, apart from storing data and making it available, which is of course important, is to select what data should be preserved and what not. And it is not an easy question, of course. And I do not even mention on the top of the huge amount of data which is generated in the form of static data, if you want, all what is generated from real-time devices, which maybe was to be preserved, maybe needs to be in a way reworked before being archived for a longer term reuse. It's also important, I always like to remind that it's always important to keep in mind that even if we are speaking here of open data, not necessarily all these data have the same identical rules for their use. So it is very important that once data are archived, they also store the way in which these data can be reused, because there might be maybe limitations, something linked to IPRs and so on. So it's also important, because it's crucial for the users to know exactly how data can be reused. Standards are, of course, an important component, an important issue. I can also mention here what I know in our experience in terms of making available data, for example, through open data portals. We have agreed and we are working together with member states in deploying more and more standards, at least for metadata. So for cataloging data, to make available a common way of cataloging data, which can help reusers to find data across domains and across countries. And this is, of course, something which should also be preserved and maybe further developed at the level of archiving those data. And in this sense, of course, the eArchiving building block is one of these components which should facilitate, it's same is facilitating, as many other building blocks, is facilitating the deployment at the European level of common standards, so that there is an easier way of accessing, in this case, data archived somewhere, and in other cases, doing other manipulations of data through building blocks or accessing more easily data. I think I may stop here, and maybe I put more questions on the table, but I will, of course, very happy to reply to questions from the audience and also to contribute to a further discussion in the panel.
Thank you, Daniele. Please, Joy.
Right. Hi, my name is Joy Davidson, and I'm with the Fair is Fair project, as you heard. I think primarily we've been working to support Article 10 of the Open Data Directive, and that's really to do with research data and making it open and fair. Before I go into the questions, I thought it would be worth just spending a really quick amount of time just to make a couple of statements about the FAIR principles themselves. I think the first one that is probably very crucial to this discussion is the fact that the FAIR data principles make no reference to the length of time that data has to be kept fair or preserved. So that's very much up to the data producers, the funders, and the end users to make those decisions. The second is that open data is not the same thing as fair data, and I think Daniela picked up on this as well. And I think that's often very confusing to researchers who feel that fair data has to be shared. And I think there can be very good reasons not to share data. We heard a lot about that earlier from Louis about the e-health data that you're working with. So we can't forget that closed data can, and in many cases, should be made fair. So we have to remember that there is a distinction, and we have to make that clear. The third thing I just wanted to stress is that the principles apply equally to the metadata description as they do to the data themselves. So in cases where data can't be shared for sensitivity reasons or ethical reasons or commercial reasons, we do want that metadata to be findable and accessible so that people know that data exists and that they can find out from that metadata, as we heard, how they can actually request legitimate access. So those, I think, are really key points to bear in mind in terms of FAIR and how it relates to the longer term preservation. So again, I just wanted to pick up on the preservation angle. I think we heard this morning and a few times already today that it's not desirable to keep everything. We don't want to do that. It's not practical, and it really doesn't help if we have lots and lots of data that isn't useful. So we have to be making decisions about where we invest our time and effort and money. And I think this is something that is really important to pick up. We need to start moving those decisions away from just at the point of deposit to an archive and move it down in the life cycle. So we would see this very much in the research data realm as something that you would start to do within a data management plan. Start to think about which data might have value and planning over the entire life of the project, how you'll manage that data and add value to it iteratively over the course of the project. The directive does talk about high value data sets in Articles 13 and 14. One of the things it doesn't explicitly say in those articles is speaking about FAIR. A couple of them indirectly talk about FAIR principles, but I think that is something that maybe could be a little bit more explicit in the directive. It's just that high value data sets should also be made FAIR. And that is something that's, there's a lot of work going on in many projects right now to try and think about how you assess the fairness of data. So there are lots of tools that will help you to do that. In the Fair is Fair project, for example, we're working on an automatic tool that will help you to look at the fairness of data in repositories. So I think we should start to look at high value and FAIR and start to think how they work together. So the question about the role of archives and what they can do, I agree with what Daniela said, that they certainly do have a role to play in making FAIR data accessible over time. I would also say that they do have a role to play in the selection and appraisal, but I would again stress that the data producers have a huge role to play in selecting and appraising data, and that this really should be starting as early on in the life cycle as possible. So again, the use of data management plans to help people to really think about this is going to be crucial. And in that respect, we would like to see more open science policies really requiring data management planning and putting an emphasis on this. One thing I think we need to be aware of is that, yes, you can do retrospective verification, if you like, on data that comes into an archive, but that is very expensive and it takes a lot of time and effort. And I think it's not necessarily the best use of our resources. So if we can push those kinds of verification activities earlier into the life cycle, it is more efficient and it saves us money in the long run. So coming on to the next question, question 3 about common standards. I agree very much that we still have quite a lot of work to do on trying to reach convergence and common standards. One of the things that we are currently looking at as a potential activity that could be useful is the use of the DCAT metadata standard. And this is already used quite often within the open data government community. It's something that we've been looking at. Several initiatives in the research data community are looking at this. So GoFair and Fair is Fair project as well are looking at how DCAT might be better used to support interoperability of metadata catalogs across domains. But I think if we are then looking at government data and research data, DCAT again serves as a nice potential solution to allow searchability across public sector information and research data. So I think there's a lot of work we can still pick up on in that respect. Question 4 with the eArchiving block. I think one of the key things that is important to all of us is that none of this stuff is something that people can easily pick up and do without a little bit of support. And I think one of the key things about the eArchiving activity is that you do offer a lot of support to people to help get them onboarded to the activities. So you're looking at trying to increase capacity. And again, I think this is something that a lot of initiatives are doing. There's efforts trying to increase capacity amongst policymakers, data producers, service providers and potential reusers. So it's covering pretty much everyone and every actor in the ecosystem. So I think there could be a lot more cooperation amongst these initiatives to try and build that capacity. So I think that would certainly be one of the things that I would stress as an area that we can pick up on going forward. And I think I've used up most of my time, so I'll maybe stop and over to the
Yes, thank you very much, Joy, for your interesting views. So go to Andreas. Andy, please.
Sure. So trying to answer these questions that you posed here, I would like to point actually back to some of the definitions of digital preservation, because trying to understand what the relevance of it is in terms of reuse of open data. If we consider one of the many definitions that we find as being about keeping data accessible and usable in an authentic manner, and knowing that the value of data increases over time, but data does not stay accessible and usable all by itself, the answer should be pretty simple. No digital preservation, no open data in the long run. And so it's actually extremely relevant. And the issue that I see mostly why some people do not see the relevance to be as important as it actually is because there seems still to be too much focus on bitstream preservation. I don't know how many times we have to argue this, and I'm preaching to the wrong crowd, obviously. But my feeling is that archiving is not just storing data. We know that, but a large fraction of this, even stakeholder community of users of data, of producers of data, of owners of data, don't know that yet. And so we need to find mechanisms to get that message across, that digital preservation is not just about storing data. Now, when we take a look at the more complex levels of digital preservation, where the relevance increases, in my opinion, for the logical preservation, I think we need to take a big step towards getting the knowledge into the source systems. We still tend to see digital preservation as something that comes after the data has been produced. And what we actually want is preservable data in the first place and in situ where it is. So I don't understand why it's still, for example, permissible to have a lot of data in weird, abstract, undocumented binary formats in a system, which makes life difficult for all of us. And why, if such systems do exist, why they're still allowed to have the data that way and not have an export function. Last week, we had a medical software that was about to be retired, and it had a backup functionality built into the software. So we executed that one. It produced a wonderful backup of the source system, but again, in the same binary format as the source system was using it. So that backup is useless without the original software. Now that data has to be kept, in that specific case that we had, was for another 15 years. It's irrational to accept such or to assume that this will be alive and usable. So I think we need to have a different approach to make that relevance more easily graspable and to move the digital preservation relevance to where it is. And this will be, I guess, the key message from most of my answers here. And the same thing applies for the real challenge of digital preservation that is coming, which is on the semantic layer. We have been dealing with the semantic, we have been neglecting the semantic layer mostly because it was always, we model it via some ontologies, how terminology changes. But we see much more burning issues on the semantic layer in the subtle, when we talk about sensor data, open data that's being collected from measurement devices, subtle issues on the very technical level of sensor calibration functions, data transformations that are being applied, the different precision levels of measurement, encoding artifacts and all of that. So things we have, that includes at least myself, usually shied away from or not considered as burning as some of the more immediate questions. I think we need to revisit those and start addressing those. For the second question, what should be the role of archives and other memory institutions? Obviously an extremely big one. But again, I guess to get the message across, we need to get rid of the stigma that archiving something means putting it to a final resting place, which still is in many people's mind. And digital preservation, in my opinion, must move into the life systems, and preservation and thus archival functionality, which includes the technical parts, but also the whole mindset, the thinking, needs to become a core functionality of the entire data infrastructure. Preservation functionality needs to be considered as much as we consider security for any data infrastructure. For any software system that has accounts, we have security issues. We consider energy as part of everything that we do. We deal with accounting planning and cost planning. The same way we do all this, we should consider digital preservation as part of any infrastructure we are rolling out, of any software that we are deploying. And that will move the archives into the core functionality, not as an archive, as a building, as an own institution, as something that is separate from the live system where things get transferred to, but which is basically integrated and immersive everywhere. And we also, I think, need to become a bit more forward-looking and anticipating the challenges that we will see arriving. With all this digitization that has happened now in this last year, sometimes by forced, fantastic, a huge speed up, we have taken steps that nobody would have considered possible in a 5-year time frame now within a single year. But that also leads to new problems that we will need to address. Here's the second definition of digital preservation that I would like to reactivate a bit, which is digital preservation is interoperability across time. And this leads to a very interesting thing, because if we can manage to solve interoperability across time, we should be able to solve interoperability now. And who of us doesn't have interoperability problems with different versions of software and data files and so on now? Moving between whatever laptop on whatever one operating system, my workstation on another operating system, and then the tablet and mobile phone running on yet another operating system. So I think if we consider the competences and skills that we have in solving such interoperability problems across time, we could be helpful in addressing a lot of the interoperability questions that we have now. And this means that no IT system can live without some core DP concepts, in my opinion. Last but not least, and I won't be able to answer all 4 questions, but we'll finish after the third one, just to give space to the next speaker. But is there a need for common standards, and should we converge them? Yes, obviously. But again, I'm a bit wary when the statement is convergence towards common standards. First of all, convergence is a slow process. I want to see interoperability, and not by declared compliance to some standards, but by demonstrated interoperability. And there are some domains that are a bit ahead of us. So I know that producers in the medical imaging domain, so whatever, X-ray and so on, those systems, they have, I guess, is it biannual meetings where products of different vendors are randomly put together, and they say you get 4 hours to demonstrate, or 6 hours to demonstrate how you get the data from here to there, from system A into system B, without any loss of information. If it takes more than those allotted amount of hours, then your 2 systems are not compatible, not sufficiently compatible. And those hackathons, I mean, they're good for the industry because they demonstrate that this interoperability is happening, but it would also make our lives much easier. And so I think we need to move towards that understanding of converging towards common standards. So a demonstrated convergence, not just a declared one. What steps should be taken by the projects that I'm involved with? Well, here I've got an easy way to chicken out a little bit, because most of my projects are research projects rather than development, and definitely not deployment projects. And so here we see less of a need to converge towards a standard right now, because we need to develop an understanding of what good standards would be 5 years into the future, or even longer than that. But again, the concept and the thinking process are essential. And I think what we also need to consider in that respect is future use cases. I enjoyed it very much this morning when we had the case study from the Norwegian Health Archives, when they were talking about, we can issue queries now in the archive. What kind of queries can we issue against that preserved data? What purpose will that data serve? Because it changes its purpose once it becomes older data, in a sense. And so thinking of this future use is, I guess, one of the key challenges that we have to address here.
Thank you, Andy. Let's go to Igor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So as Carlota mentioned in the introduction, I'm coming from the statistical office, mostly working with geospatial statistics, but now I'm also in the dissemination unit, and I will share our example from the user perspective. So when a user comes, and that is in real life, they would like to see the population development, for instance, in Ljubljana, in our capital, for the last 50 or 100 years. So how can we, as a statistical office, support such a user? The situation that we are facing is that, and why we see the relevance in preserving our data, is that NSIs, so the statistical offices, normally would not preserve the data either because of the legislation. Microdata, these are the data that are directly obtained from the reporting units. These are people, enterprises, and so on, have to be destroyed. And some data are simply not needed after we process them, or we consider them, they are not needed anymore. And for some data, we just don't have a clear understanding today what could be the use of this data, for instance, over the next 10 or 20 years. So if you just imagine how the technology developed for the spatial statistics like Google Maps and GPSs and all the tools and applications that you have to visualize the data, so this opens entirely new possibilities to reuse the statistics. Coincidentally, in our case, we can support such a user for the last 40, 50 years, but this is not done systematically. There are no standards. Normally, it would take us several months to prepare the data for such a user, to study again the old methodologies. You can imagine that we don't count the people the same way all the time. So in this regard, we see a great advantage if there is an institution on the national or EU level that preserves this data. As Danielle mentioned, what's the important thing is that together with their archives, we could decide which data are worthy of preserving. And also mentioned by Joy, particularly the statistical data, you can imagine they are sensitive. So there should be rules how this data can be accessible. But it is much easier for us if this is done by some legislation that somehow governs this area of archiving, and that these data are not anymore officially our data. So the archives to take the lead and to accept the role of coordinator between various data providers. In our case that I'm giving is not just statistical office, is, let's say, also the data provider for the spatial data. This is the mapping agency in our case. That would be very much appreciated. And what was mentioned by Andreas is very much what we see as well, particularly because we are very much a dissemination-oriented institution, is not just that these data are stored somewhere, but that there are ways of distribution of this data, offering to the users. And here, what is very important, now we are coming to something we call statistical literacy, but now it would be sort of archives should take on this role to have the proper metadata to interpret the historical data and methodologies. I studied also geography, and I know history apart from geography, and I know exactly if I want to see a document from the 18th century, the person from the archive explains very exactly how these data should be read and understood. So in the same way, this should be then the role of the archives to have this and to ensure then the interoperability of this data, either by means of some generic standards. I'm not so expert in this area of the standard. So it could be generic formats of this open data in the future, or we could ensure constant update of the formats of this data. And what is most important, the constant linkage between the statistics and the geospatial data. So to conclude, from our user perspective, from our users, I see it not just appreciated, but extremely important and needed that there is a systematical approach to these questions. And from our national point of view, definitely I see, for instance, the National Archive, which is already taking some initiatives in this regard to the area that I'm now speaking about, as very important. So whatever outcome would be from these panels and these discussions in the future, we really welcome very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Igor. And the last but not least, Jose, por favor.
Hi, hello. Hello, good morning. Yeah, we are running out of time. So I'm going to address all the 4 questions in a wall, okay? Especially after all this, because I think everyone said everything. But in fact, I feel that I'm now in a unique position. So I've been working closely with the Portuguese government for the last year. So I got the deep insight about many public services, and the directive is precise about that. So the directive comes after a previous directive that was focused on what in the time was called public documents. Now it enlarges now the scope to data and also to scientific data. So Andy told us a lot about the challenges that, for example, when you can face when you try to access scientific data and preservation, etc. So I'm not going to repeat that. It was all clear in my understanding. But what I understand is from the point of view of the, let's say, the usual public services, this is going to be a huge challenge. So the public services, most of the public services, they are used to deal, of course, with archiving data because it's mandatory, legal. They have to do it, but not in the digital paradigm, and especially not in data itself. So they are used with documents in the, let's say, classical sense. And especially now, because if we put all this together with the FAIR requirements, now we are in a big trouble. So I understand that most of the public services in Portugal, and I believe this might be all over the place, are going to have very hard times to be able to deal with the requirements of the directive. And the solution is not going to be to deposit that in national archives or specialized archives. So they really have to develop new capabilities of archival as a local function, and to be able to deliver, because that's the most important, that not only to preserve, but also to deliver the data according to the FAIR principles. Because that's another requirement of the directive. So the API, the automatic access from external systems to the systems of the public services. So that's another big requirement. So I understand this is going to be a big challenge. So if you want to make it simple, probably you might say that you are talking about the delivery information package, or dissemination information package, the IP. So we need a new focus. I think we need to revise everything we have been doing about the IPs. And probably this is going to be an interesting challenge for the future, I say, reference activities like eArchiving, like the building block. I think it could be very interesting that in the future, as a building block, we could revise everything we have been doing and have been proposing on the delivery of information access, the IPs, etc., and probably try to came out with some more effective suggestions so the archives can use, so national archives or big archives can recommend, but also, and for example, also to recommend to the providers, the software providers. Because I think that for those public services that I'm focused now, they are not going to coin the solution themselves. So the solution has to come from the market. So they are going to adopt the best solutions from the market. And in that sense, we are very happy that in the present shape of the eArchiving building block, we have a large number of producers, of technological producers engaged with us. So that's very good. And so that's something we should care more in the future, because I think this is going to be the challenge. So I think with this, I try to address the 4 points altogether. I guess I'm not sure if I was successful on that, but if there are questions, let's go on that. I finished.
Could I just jump in at this point? Sorry, Carlotta and Jose, because we had a question from Winifred Reichhardt, which was on what would be an example of a research question on public sector information, like a catalogue of such questions. The thing moved. Would help define which public sector information should be preserved. I just wondered if you had any view on that question. So it's the one, it's in the chat. It's what would be an example of a research.
I'm trying to reach it. Is the most recent one?
No, it's just up a little bit by Winifred.
So who asked it?
Winifred Reichhardt.
There is what would be an example of a research question on public sector information.
Yeah. Well, there is an interesting characteristic of most of a specific domain of this public information is that it is not big data, so it is administrative data. It's not very complex from the point of view of its structure, because most of it relies on let's say relational databases and produced by let's say normal systems after well-described processes. So the problem is real on semantics. So the semantics of that data. For example, now we are working in Portugal in a portal for application of European fundings, etc., etc. And the most serious problem we have is semantics, because in different programs, sometimes the same concept is named different way. So of course we don't want to give the data to the public as it is, as it comes from those systems, right? Because I see a reporter probably can go there, can understand, but the normal citizen will never be able to understand it. So it fails as a communication, right? So that's semantics, and that of course goes directly to FAIR. So I think the focus of public administration as a domain of research from the ontological point of view, I think it's a very interesting challenge. And in fact, the Commission has an activity on that around another directive, which is a directive for the single digital gateway, which is supposed to be the European portal of service publics for all over Europe. So it's an activity, and also the activity we mentioned here for the reference architecture that we are promoting on eArchiving. I see all those things going in the same direction, but now, until now, they are a bit dispersed. So probably we need future work on trying to consolidate that. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Okay. So I don't know, Carlotta, if you had anything to add, or
no, just to say thank you to our panelists for your inspiring ideas. What I find with a great agreement and common understanding on what we have to do, and I see that the challenge is to start to do what we agree that is the best way to achieve this big challenge of preserving along the time.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Carlotta, for your excellent moderation there as well. I think it was a really good session, and indeed thanks to everyone who's also shared thoughts and ideas in the chat. We're actually over time right now, so maybe we can take just a minute or so for Fulgencio, if you would like to maybe bring together some of the themes of today's session. Fulgencio? Well, if not, I was just seeing Fulgencio online, so maybe it's a slight technical hiccup. Okay, well, okay, never mind. Adelina? Okay, no. I'm trying to think who might be best placed to say something. I don't know, Janet, if you want to say a quick, I don't know, a very quick thank you summary.
Yep, that's fine. I'd like to thank everybody for a really interesting and informative session. It's been lovely to have a really practical session today. So right from the very beginning, we've had Rihanna setting out the European Commission's objectives to go beyond the archives. And we've seen that very much today. We've been going into e-health, databases, geographic systems, data producers. We've really tried to show you that we're not just giving you a set of instructions from National Archives, but we're really moving forward into many different sectors and domains, and really listening to people in those domains and sectors, and making sure that we work with those experts with their practical problems. And I think we've really seen that today. And that's what we wanted to show you about e-archiving in action. So it's been a really successful day. We've managed to keep to time overall, pretty much. It's our first time online like this, an online event, so it's quite strange for us. But so you've had the introduction, so that will have been for everybody in all three sessions for today, Wednesday and Thursday, and then today's has been just for data producers. And we hope that you've really felt that we focused on the needs of data producers, whether it's in administrations or in research institutions, whatever. So thank you very much, and we may see you at the next one, or we may not, on Wednesday. Wednesday is the archives and data digital preservation, and Thursday is for solution providers. But thank you very much for joining with us. Thank you very much to all our presenters, particularly thank you Tom and Pavel for hosting everything successfully. Till next time.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye. Bye.